Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform.
Welcome to our first ever podcast episode. We're going to introduce ourselves. In fact, I'm going to introduce Sam Hardy, who is a academic. Is that how I say it, Sam?
Yes.
Now, Sam is fascinated by conflict stories, how people tell them, why people tell them, and how people's conflict stories can either entrap or empower them. In her PhD, she's very educated. Sam identified two distinct types of conflict stories, one that supported constructive conflict engagement and another that people ended up in blame and suffering. Sam is the director of the Conflict Management Academy and founder of the Real Conflict Coaching System, a very practical tool to help people develop more constructive conflict stories and become the hero in the next chapter of their lives. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome to Scott. I'll introduce Scott now. Scott is the conflict whisperer and the fun maker. What an awesome line. He has a Bachelor of Social Work and a Bachelor of Science, so also highly educated, and has probably more street smarts than me. My mother always jokes that I got in the academic queue twice and missed out on common sense. Scott is known as the most engaging, insightful, and enjoyable keynote speaker and trainer in the conflict resolution arena, and I can totally agree with that. He's so much fun, as you will find out. He is the CEO of Fighting Fair and the creator of Conflict Intelligence and the go-to expert for difficult conversations. Scott is passionate about conflict stories like me. He has facilitated 500 plus mediation sessions and 100 plus mindful team culture workshops, and he loves seeing the transformative power once people truly start to hear and understand each other. Such a great mission in life, Scott.
Well, I think we've got similar missions, don't we, Sam?
Yes, that's right. Our secret cunning plan is world peace, right?
That's right. We start with workplace peace and then it expands out, doesn't it? I guess it'd be probably useful, Sam, to share why we're doing this podcast. Do you want to share with the audience what this is about, why we're doing it?
Scott, you and I are always talking to each other and we're always fascinated with conflict stories, but we also really recognise that in society these days, conflict is a bit of a dirty word. People don't like it. They think it shouldn't exist. They want to avoid it. When it arises, they want it to go away as quickly as possible. And I guess implied in our work is that conflict is a normal thing. It doesn't make it easy or comfortable, but it is something that we can learn to engage with and manage. And part of the purpose of this podcast, I guess, is to normalise conflict as part of life. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, look, I think so too. It's about normalising. I think it's also gaining insight. It's learning, I guess, hearing, because we're going to have guests on, not just ourselves all the time. And for me, it's about, well, what have people learned from their conflicts? How can we see it as a teacher rather than, as you say, not wanting to deal with it, not wanting to go into conflict? So it's about how do we learn, how do we not repeat perhaps patterns that we potentially fall into, taking that mindset of, okay, what is this about for me? What can I learn?
Conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. What makes it good or bad is how we manage it. And even bad conflict can be a learning opportunity, can't it?
It certainly can. I mean, as you say, a lot of people find it challenging, and I think that's the emotional aspect. It feels uncomfortable. And I don't think that necessarily changes. It's more about our mindset and how we manage it and what we can learn from it, I think, is the area that a lot of people shy away from. Our purpose is making it normal and let's learn. We're going to hopefully share a few insights, but also draw out insights from the guests. We've got some professionals who are going to join us, and potentially some celebrities. But it's really aimed for people in the workplace, isn't it? People who are dealing with conflict, mainly in the work. But we'll talk about some personal stuff as well, I'm sure. But how do you deal with conflict and how do you do that well? What have you learned? And obviously about sharing stories as well.
Mm. And it's always really useful to listen to other people's experiences of conflict. We can
Yeah.
learn from other people's stories. We can learn from the good things that they did and the things that maybe in hindsight weren't the smartest choices. It also makes us feel part of a common humanity. Everybody has conflict. Everybody finds it difficult, but everybody can learn to manage it more effectively with a
Yeah.
little bit of reflection and support.
What I find when I run, say, difficult conversations training is that people don't often have the process, the model, and the right sort of mindset going into those conversations. And that's when it gets really tricky. They put it off or they make it worse.
Yeah.
So having those skills and tools, I think, is really helpful as well. So what do you reckon? I was thinking maybe we could start by interviewing each other around the types of questions we might be asking the guests.
I think it's only
And
fair that we put ourselves on the line first.
that's it. So I'm going to start. What would you say your conflict story is? How do you get along with conflict? How would you describe that?
Look, I love conflict. Other people's conflict. Other people's conflict. I can work with other people's conflict all day. It's like reality TV for me. But personally, I am not so great in conflict. And this is something I think people are surprised to hear, that very often people who work in this field as mediators or conflict management coaches or trainers, we go through exactly the same challenges of managing conflict when we're personally involved as everybody else does. And having that academic knowledge does give you a little bit of a head start intellectually, but sometimes in the heat of the moment, we do things that in hindsight we would be talking to our clients about. And I think it's important to recognize that we are all human. And when you're in the heat of conflict, you do make mistakes and you're not necessarily your best self. So I think that's my first admission, that while I'm very good with other people's conflicts, sometimes I'm not very proud of the way I behave in my own. Do you find that as well, Scott? Are you perfect with no conflict in your life?
I just can't believe you'd even ask me that question. No, of course. And look, when you say that, I think of that whole emotional component to conflict and how we're not thinking clearly. And I reckon that's one of the biggest challenges in conflict is the emotions take over. And that's, as you say, we're not going to do the most rational things. And look, I agree. I mean, it's an interesting question for our guests when they come on. Do they deal with conflict differently at home compared to in the workplace?
Yeah. I think context has a lot to do with it, and sometimes that does relate to the emotional side that you mentioned, that we have different emotional relationships with people in our homes, in our families, than we do in the workplace. And maybe if, work is kind of our life and our identity is really tied up with it, then we might have a lot more emotions tied up with a conflict that arises in the workplace. But I think also I want to talk about that distinction between emotions and rationality, because I think it is a bit of a spectrum, and I don't think we can say, oh, this is emotional and this is rational. They are intermingled. And I think the thing is that we're not asking people to be robotic. We're not asking them to not have emotions, to just be rational. What I think we have to support people to do is to manage the emotions, to acknowledge them, to be aware of how your emotions get in the way sometimes of managing conflict. They can, if you manage them effectively, actually be useful in conflict. So it's about working with and through those emotions to make good choices. It's not about putting them in a box and pretending they don't exist, which is really not possible. So I think that's important for people to recognise that emotions are okay. They are challenging to manage, but we don't want to try and suppress them.
I agree, Sam. I think it's not trying to suppress emotions, acknowledging them and then trying to work with them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest challenges,
Yeah. And you asked me about my experience with conflict growing up and how I got into this. And I think that is kind of an interesting story in itself, because I grew up in a family. My dad was a very strong personality. Children were to be seen and not heard. He was quite a strict parent. He had very clear ideas about what was right and wrong, and generally that meant he was right and we were wrong. In that sort of environment, you learn very quickly to be an accommodator. But the problem was that I had a very strong personality and strong beliefs, which in many respects were different from my father's. So we used to have very heated debates, shall we say. Reframing it, actually, we had heated arguments at the dinner table every night, and neither of us would give up easily. And my poor mum and brother would sit there and roll their eyes about what are they going to have an argument about this time. And one of the things that was constantly said to me was that I was very argumentative. I was very good at arguing. And so, I mean, the logical career choice for me was to become a lawyer, where arguing is your career. And I did that 5 years. And then I did some mediation training and realised that actually this was a much more effective way to help people manage conflicts, because I noticed that my clients, I did a lot of litigation, so court cases, and even when people won, they were still really resentful. They were still feeling really unhappy, and they didn't feel as if the compensation made it all go away. Probably didn't help when they get their lawyer's bill and then there wasn't a whole lot of money left anyway.
That's right.
But I suddenly got introduced to mediation, where people were involved, where they participated in the process rather than having lawyers do it for them. And it just seemed so much more sensible and personal. And I noticed that even when in mediation people didn't get the outcome that they were looking for, they felt more comfortable with it because they were involved in the process. They understood how that outcome resulted, and they were engaged in making choices about it. So that was a big kind of epiphany. I'm going to become a mediator. And I quit my job as a lawyer, much to the horror of my family. But it turned out that this was a much better fit for me. So I'm really glad I made that choice. How about you, Scott? Wow. What was it like for you?
I find your story very interesting. My background, my family background was a bit challenging, actually. So a bit personal, but my father died when I was just over one. And then my mum remarried and they had a couple of kids. And then unfortunately, and quite sadly, my mum died of cancer when I was in grade 6.
Oh, gosh.
So, yeah, it was pretty challenging, and I really lacked confidence during my teenage years. And look, I get on with my stepfather now. At the time, he was obviously dealing with his own grief and loss, and he was looking after 4 kids, a couple of teenagers. I was almost a teenager. I've got an older sister and then 2 younger half-brothers. We didn't get on that well, so I had a lot of conflict with him. I think he said this to me once. I had a big chip on my shoulder.
Understandably, too. It's a bit unfair.
I did, but, obviously didn't work through a lot of that grief and loss with my parents and understand it very well. So, yeah, I really struggled as a teenager. That carried on into my 20s. A lot of conflict with the family. Didn't feel understood, which to me is one of the most important things in conflict, is understanding each other, even if you see it differently. I went and did a science degree, major in psych, and then I sort of got lost. I got into sales. I wasn't good at it. The boss came with me on a sale and I didn't sell the alarm. And I said, how did I go? And he goes, not good. So I quit, and I found myself volunteering in an agency in Melbourne in parent adolescent mediation. So young people at risk of homelessness, teenagers. And I really liked it. And it's probably, now I reflect on it, a number of years later, it's probably an unconscious thing about wanting to help people, especially teenagers, feel heard.
Yeah.
It sort of came semi-naturally to me. I felt pretty comfortable with it as I learned the process. And then I did social work and then spent 9 years as a parent adolescent mediator. Then moved up to Byron and started more focusing on workplace conflict. So I think that upbringing pushed me in the direction of mediation, wanting to help others to have a better experience, especially in that teenage years of just parents and young people hearing each other. which they struggle with.
It's such a core skill, isn't it? Being able to manage conflict and being able to listen well and ask
Yep,
questions and understand one another. It's such a fundamental requirement of getting along. And yet
that
we
is.
don't really teach people how to do it. We just
No.
expect that you somehow know how. And we all know in this field that most people don't really know how.
Yeah.
Or they do the training, but then they don't have the confidence to put it into action. Wouldn't it be great if we could have that as a core criteria in all the curriculums at school? And
I
instead
have
of
it.
having debating competitions, we could have, I don't know, listening competitions.
Yeah, that's right. I've got a few more questions here. I thought maybe we jump onto some of these. How has your conflict story changed, Sam? How would you describe the change over that time?
I think my story has changed as a result of life experience, as a result of a lot of the work that I've been doing in research and academia and working with a lot of people in conflict. I think when I started out, when I was young and going into law, conflict was all about arguing and winning. It was about having the best argument, the best evidence, being the most persuasive speaker. I think what I've learned over time is that while you might win, the outcome might not be the best outcome. I think I've learned that there's a distinction between being right or winning and having a good
Yes.
outcome and maintaining
Yes.
relationships so that that outcome can be
Yes.
maintained and put into practice. So one of the things I found, the difference between having someone make a decision for you and you being involved in having sometimes difficult conversations and making your own decisions, means that you're much more likely to do what you say you're going to do if you've been involved. So I
Yeah.
think firstly, it's a change between right and wrong, winning and losing, to a more integrative type approach where people can collaborate together. And it doesn't mean we
Yep.
always get a perfect outcome or justice, but
Yep.
even if the outcome isn't ideal, we learn a lot about one another. We're more invested in what happens next, and we
Yeah.
feel more empowered. And I think that's a
Yes.
really important part of managing conflict
Yeah.
well, taking responsibility to get through
Yeah.
that complexity and uncertainty and the awkwardness of talking about those hard things. And it can really make a difference to people's lives.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. And what about
Nice.
you, moving from working with parents and teenagers and
Mm,
then into the workplace? Has that
mm.
made a shift in the way that you think about conflict?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that because I did a little bit of family law as well at the start, didn't like it because it's too all unhappy. What I've noticed is that the process is similar. It's very similar whether you're doing parent-adolescent conflict or workplace conflict or having a difficult conversation. And I think it's about, for me, as you say, it's having an outcome where people have ownership, feel more empowered, but also that thing where they feel heard and understood, whether they agree with each other's perspective. It's that heard and understood that I think has a lot of the power. I was thinking of that Harvard course, and I think you went to that too. And I remember one of the professors talking about most of the time when we're having a difficult conversation or negotiating something, we just focus on the content, but we don't often focus on the relationship. And I think things like mediation help you focus on the process, which is one component, the content, which is obviously important, and then also how do you want that relationship to be after this interaction, after this process?
Yeah.
It's in embracing all those three, and that's when I think you get the best outcome.
I've heard people say that, and then other people respond by saying, but I don't want a relationship with them in the future. We're divorcing or I'm leaving that workplace. And
Mm,
so I would reframe the word relationship to how you want to relate to one another.
I
So that's a
like
little
that.
reframe I like to use. I don't say about
Yeah,
the relationship, I say, how would you like to relate to one another in the future? And it gives people a little
yeah.
more room to move.
Nice. I like you're already showing me up, Sam. I'm not happy.
Don't worry, your turn's coming. I would like to know, Scott, whether you deal with conflict differently in personal conflict or professional.
Look, I'm a bit like you. I'm much more comfortable mediating someone else's dispute than dealing with my own. Having said that, I think I've got much better at dealing with my own conflicts. I do talk about the conflict characters often in my mediation training. I'm sure you're aware of those: the teddy, the turtle, the shark. and the owl. Some people use a fox, but
Which one are
um,
you, Scott?
oh, look, I try to be the owl, but there will be times when I'm a little bit of a teddy. So that's, the trying to please people. Sometimes I will be the turtle. Try not to be the shark, which is the aggressive one, obviously. But yeah, look, depending on who it is in the relationship, but I'm conscious about trying to be the owl, be assertive, manage my tone, think about how I have that conversation, being open to the other perspective. So I think because I've run the difficult conversation, I don't know, 100 to maybe 200 times, it is ingrained in me. So I try, but like you, emotions can be tricky. That's the biggest challenge. I was going to ask you, what's a really tricky conflict that you've had to manage, whether it be yourself or you mediating a dispute? What's been one of the trickiest ones that you've had to deal with?
I think just as a little bit of a lead into it, my natural instinct is to be a teddy. I want everyone to like me, and I will
Yeah.
often accommodate other people when it's not really what I want, just to keep everyone happy. So that's a natural tendency of mine. When things get a bit tricky, I do tend to do the turtle and just avoid it. I have learnt to try and prepare and be the owl and be more assertive. But I think sometimes what happens for me is if I am too emotional or too afraid, I can accidentally go too far and become the shark. So I can go from one extreme to the other. I'll be this nice little teddy and then I'll flip into shark and kind of miss the owl. And I have to really consciously work at that. Sometimes it's a fine line between being assertive and aggressive. And I can sometimes flip over and go too hard trying to be assertive.
Yes.
And I think that's from lack of practice too. I think the more you practice being assertive, the more comfortable you are with it. The most difficult conflict I had was with someone that I used to work with, and there were whole lots of things going on around us. So we got involved in a bigger contextual conflict, and we were sort of the pawns in the middle of it. But it got to the point where we really needed to have a conversation. And she had been avoiding me. She hadn't come into the office for a couple of weeks, and she'd actually resigned. So she was coming into the office to get belongings. And so I messaged and said, look, can we go into the meeting room and actually have a conversation, because I don't want to leave it like this. And I really prepared for it. I did everything according to the book. I sat down and you could have cut the air with a knife. It was very tense. And I did my big spiel, how much I admired her and thanked her, and I said all the nice things. And she started to get a little bit teary, which was unusual for her. And I thought, oh, I'm getting through. This is really working. And I asked what she needed for us to maintain a good relationship. And I sat there waiting for this really positive response. And all of a sudden, it was like the shutters went down. And she basically said, I hate you. I'm going to be civil with you in the future, but I'm never going to forgive you for what's happened. And don't expect me to ever support you again. And she got up and walked out. And I was like,
Wow.
okay, okay. I feel like I did everything I was supposed to do then. And it didn't work. And I think that's what you said a moment ago. It does depend a little bit on the other person. And I was a bit disappointed and surprised, but also I felt good about myself because I did really try. And I feel like there was nothing I could have done to get a different result. But it is a bit disheartening when you put your best effort in and you get nothing back.
Yeah, that's a surprising response.
Yeah.
To those words is pretty full on, and it's interesting because when it's like how much of conflict is projection. Do you know what I mean? This is what I see with mediation, that parties come in and they've made a lot of assumptions. There's been many misunderstandings generally. But the biggest problem is they create those stories in their head about this other person, and they almost demonize, to use the word hate so full on. So what's that about? And that's where I think, I know you do a lot of conflict coaching. It's about, what is this about for me? What is mine here in this? And I think that's so important, to not get to the stage where you're hating people and go, what of this is mine? And how much am I projecting onto the other? I think it's so important. Otherwise, we can get stuck in them being the bad one.
Yeah, and I think in hindsight, she had a great deal of imposter syndrome, and a lot of that
Mm,
was a shield, a protection for herself.
mm,
She is brilliant and very good at what she
mm.
does. She has a very strong imposter syndrome, so I think she feels under threat all the time, and that's her protective
Yes.
mechanism, which is sad.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because for me, that whole aspect of identity is such a big
Mm,
part of conflict too, or difficult conversations. That's sometimes why we find it so hard or find it so challenging because of how we might be seen or how we might perceive ourselves. And for the other person, what impact might that have on their identity? And I always think that is a big key challenge. I ask that in my difficult conversation training, like they bring a difficult conversation, they apply the theory to it. And when we get to the identity, I say, well, how big is the identity aspect in your difficult conversation?
mhm.
And almost everyone, it's either big for them, for the other, or both. It's very rarely that it's not a significant part. And
Yeah.
that to me is really interesting. One of my conflict situations actually with my neighbor. I've got two neighbors that I've had challenges with. One because of noise and music, and the other one because of smoke. I think the interesting thing for me is how that impacted my identity because both were, one was never willing to have a discussion. The other one we did, and we sort of came up with the solution, and it didn't quite work. So I tried to engage again before the fire season or the cold season in Byron, and they said, "No, I don't want to talk about it." And it was interesting because that sort of impacted my identity because it's like, well, you're a conflict fellow. You take people conflict. Aren't you supposed to be able to fix any conflict that you coming, And so it was hard and it's also good because I realized that, hey, there are times when there's a total lack of willingness for whatever reason, and that makes it really tricky to resolve the conflict.
Mm,
And it is different, neighbours, compared to workplace, because in a workplace, there's certain requirements. There's policies, procedures, code of conduct, which means you can't just say, I don't want to talk about it. There's other processes you can go through if they're unwilling to talk through a concern.
yeah. And I think that's something we need to be really realistic about. Not all conflict can be resolved. And that can
Yep.
sometimes be because one of the parties isn't willing to engage. Sometimes it can be
Yes.
because of contextual, structural policies that don't allow
Yes.
that to happen. Sometimes it can be value differences or cultural differences that people are
Yes.
never going to be able to agree on a particular outcome.
Yes.
And I think what we have to remember is there's still things we can do to engage with people despite those differences. In an ideal world, we don't just resolve conflict, we transform people's relationships and their sense of identity and their skills and confidence to manage conflict in the future. Step back from that, maybe we come up with a resolution that everyone can live with. And step back from that, we can still engage in constructive management of ongoing conflict, recognizing that,
Mm.
like if you're separating parents and you've got little kids, your relationship as a couple might be ended and you might sort out the property and you might sort out, who's got the kids with them when. But you're going to have a relationship as a co-parent for, I don't know, the rest of your life, basically. And that conflict is always going to be there at some level. And so what we can do is support people to manage that conflict in a constructive way, given that they're always going to have differences of opinions around Christmas
Yeah.
or boundaries and those sorts of things. So I think
Yes.
that we have to be optimistic but not idealistic about conflict. There's
Yeah.
usually more we can do than we recognize, but we don't always get the perfect outcome transformation. We should work
No.
towards that because it may be available, but not to beat
Yeah.
ourselves up too much when we don't get that perfect outcome.
Yeah, that's it. And that's why I like the idea of then getting insight into yourself.
Yeah.
What's this about for me? What can I learn? What insight can I gain from this that will help me to let go of it a bit more, to not hold on to the whatever emotion it might be? What do you reckon has been your biggest learning over the years, Sam?
So hopefully I haven't had my biggest learning yet. Hopefully there's more to come. I think the thing about conflict stories. I think that particularly in Western culture, but I have worked a lot in Hong Kong and Singapore and China, and there seems to be some consistency in those different cultural contexts that most humans tend to talk about conflict, tell themselves stories about conflict, and tell, the people on their side the stories about conflict in a very structured way. And it's kind of a melodramatic way of telling stories. So, we're the innocent victim, they're the bad guy, they've done all these terrible things to us, and we want someone to fix it. We want some sort of justice. That's a very common way to frame conflict. And when we tell ourselves those sorts of stories, and you will all know that when you're in conflict, you can't just stop thinking about it. It sort of takes over your life, and you're thinking about it all the time, and you lie awake at night. And as you're doing that, you're rehearsing this particular version of events. What happens when we do that? It simplifies our conflict story, and it becomes more consistent in our own mind, more coherent. And while that makes us feel good and kind of justified in our angst against the other person, we get rigid. We get stuck on that very narrow version of events. And then when we go to have a conversation with the other person, they've got a different version of events. And so we're resistant to opening up our conflict story and recognizing that it might only be a very skeletal account of what happened, and it might have missing bits or inconsistencies. In my coaching work, what I do is help people to explore their story, to look at the bits of information that they have that they've forgotten about or not paid attention to fill in the gaps, to look at any inconsistencies, and to think about what other people's stories might be around the same events, and hopefully encourage them to be curious about how the other person might tell that story differently. To recognize that that's a really interesting phenomenon, the differences and the different stories we tell. And once you do that, often just opening up your story opens up different choices and different possibilities to move forward in a more constructive way. Because in our standard conflict story, we're stuck and there's one particular outcome, and it usually involves something like the other person disappears off the face of the earth or gets punished in some terrible way, which is usually not available or the right outcome. So I think that's my learning, that we talk ourselves into a corner often in conflict because of the way we typically talk about conflict.
That's really interesting. And a couple of concepts come to mind. Cognitive dissonance, that it's really hard for us to hold two different stories at the same time. And that thing about, do we want them clear so we feel less vulnerable, or we feel more certain? So it links to that sort of vulnerability perhaps as well.
And as human beings, we like certainty, and conflict is inherently uncertain. It's inherently complicated and uncertain, and that's uncomfortable. But if we can get through that, we're never going to know everything. We're never going to understand everything. We're probably never going to resolve everything, but we can build a lot of bridges by listening, opening up to other stories.
Yeah. And I mean, I demonstrate that often with a couple of pictures I show in different trainings where there's a number of things in the picture, and people will see a couple of those, they won't see it all.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good analogy in terms of you don't see the full picture, and there's some biases in what you will see. I'd be interested to know what you saw in terms of the different cultures you worked with. Was there things that stood out in terms of differences of how they saw conflict or dealt with conflict working in those different countries?
I think the interesting thing for me, their personal experience of conflict tended to be the same. They often told the version of events in that very melodramatic, I'm the passive, helpless victim and the other person's the bad guy and we need justice. What was different culturally was their expectations of how they could manage it, what was appropriate in terms of management. So in some of those countries, it was not appropriate to have a conversation and talk about individual needs. It was more appropriate to talk about how to keep harmony in the family or in the workplace, and that was the priority rather than people's individual needs. or they felt that they needed to have a respected elder or someone higher in the hierarchy to provide advice and guidance about what should happen, and it wasn't appropriate for the individuals to sort it out directly themselves because that was disrespectful. And I think what was interesting is you could still use the same coaching model to explore the story with them. It just meant that their choices might be constrained or different based on their cultural expectations. And I think that's true even within the same culture. Ideas of what's acceptable given their relationship history, their personality, their comfort levels, it is different. But so far, I've found, generally speaking, apart from maybe some Buddhist monks who are very mindful and think very differently about everything, most people tend to have that very oversimplified version of events that they then hold on to the detriment of opening up choices and communication. And Scott, I know you've done lots of meditation. Has that impacted on your thinking about and capacity to engage in conflict?
It has actually, because my unhappiness drew me to India 27 years ago. I went through a few bouts of depression through teenage and into my 20s. So, yeah, I traveled to an ashram in southern India to start to practice meditation and mindfulness. And I've been over about 14 times. It has actually, because I see a real parallel between, say, mediation and mindfulness and meditation, because what meditation for me is about is that ability to separate yourself from the thoughts, not only thoughts, but feelings as well. So when I meditate, what I'm doing is I'm just watching thoughts go past, but I don't grab them. It's about allowing them to pass without judgment and letting them go. And so that ability, what it does, it gives you more space to not be caught in thoughts. And I think in conflict, that's the challenge, is how do I give myself a bit more space to be able to see it potentially a bit more objectively, but at least be able to not be so caught up in the thinking, the stories, and the emotion. And that's, I think, the real parallel between the two. And in that way, it's really helpful, because if I start to feel myself getting frustrated or reacting to someone or something, the first thing I need to do is be aware of that and not just act on that, So I'm noticing thinking and the feelings, and then it's about managing those well enough that then I can take a constructive approach to that situation. And I guess the other part is going, okay, everyone's going to react to things differently. So we've got to acknowledge part of it is that, hey, this is my reaction. They're not making me react. I'm reacting because it's something with me. And look, it might be a normal reaction in those circumstances. Most people may react like that. But it's more about acknowledging everyone's got different triggers, different stuff going on, and everyone's going to react a little bit different. So that means it's my reaction. It's my stuff, I guess.
We can't change other people. We can't force other people to do something that we want. Really, the only person we have control over is ourselves. So if we can be mindful of our own thoughts and feelings and how that impacts on our behavior, we can change those things in a way that might influence somebody else to behave differently or respond differently. And I think the meditation is really a embodiment of reflective practice. You're reflecting on your thoughts and emotions. I actually did quite a lot of Vipassana meditation, and it's funny how I got into it, because I had a relationship breakup, and we saw a poster, my friends and I, about a 10-day silent meditation retreat over Christmas, and I had nothing to do for Christmas at that particular time. And my friends were joking, saying, Sam, there's no way you could not speak for 10 days. And I said, I so could. And I actually went to this retreat on a dare that I wouldn't survive the 10 days. And I did, and I went back quite a few times, not as many as you. But I think I agree that when you're sitting there in quiet and nobody's talking to you, those stories replay in your mind, and you do tend to have all of those past conflicts and difficult moments in your life go round and round your mind. And if you can start to notice the way you're thinking about them, the way that your emotions are getting involved, you can learn from that. But it's not a comfortable experience. I never found it easy or comfortable. But gosh, it's useful, isn't it, being able to have that self-reflection and that just to create that tiny space between what might be your natural reaction and what might be a helpful reaction. Yeah.
And look, I've had to learn that those thoughts are absolutely true. So whatever I'm thinking, I don't have to believe it and I don't have to engage in it. And I think the more I've been in the spiritual world, that's what I see, is that that's the thing, that it's created through our thinking, and then our emotions get involved as well. So the more we can sort of watch and discriminate in terms of, is this wise to follow? Is this helpful to follow? Then we've got a lot more choice, a lot more autonomy. If you're not aware of your thinking, you are your thinking.
Yeah.
I stole that from Eckhart Tolle.
You should have just claimed it as your own.
But it's so interesting as a meditator, but also in conflict, because that's what happens. We get way too caught up in the stories and the emotion.
Yeah. Scott, have you had a conflict situation where the outcome was something really positive? Can you think of a good example of that?
Look, I have. I mean, I've obviously done lots of mediations, and often parties come in, heightened, unhappy with one another. And so what I really like about mediation is seeing, when they start to hear and understand each other, how that shifts the dynamic, and that way of relating to each other really changes. And even I love it when there's a joke in mediation. Now, I'm not telling the joke. They're doing the joke, and it's not let's tell a joke. It's just some fun, some enjoyable moments in the mediation. And that, most of the time, it's tense and uncomfortable. But it's really nice when there's some levity, but there's some understanding. There's a little bit of, that's a little bit enjoyable. That's a little bit fun. And so that dynamic has changed through the process, and they leave happier. They leave more peaceful.
Yeah.
I like to see that change, because often when parties come for the intake process, as you know, you see both parties separately first. You're just sitting there going, wow, this sounds, it's going to be really, really tricky. They're really stuck. And then at the process, you take them through, and then it ends up that there's a lightness. That's what I like.
Yeah. And I find even that the opportunity to have a conversation shifts the dynamic in an important way, even if they haven't necessarily resolved specific issues. That often, so many people, including myself, our natural reaction when something's going wrong is to try and avoid it, that we don't want to put ourselves in that vulnerable situation of having a conversation because we're worried it will accidentally make it worse. That's often the main reason people avoid it. The problem is the longer you leave it, the worse it becomes, and the harder it is to have the conversation. And I find often just giving people the opportunity to come into a safe space and have a conversation is almost enough of a catalyst for people to sort things out or get to know each other a little bit better. And so do you have that situation where so often you think, if this conversation had happened 6 months ago, we wouldn't even be here?
No, and that's why it's so important that people have the skills to be able to do these things early, so it doesn't get to the mediation stage.
Hey, Scott, I've got a really funny example of how a conflict situation turned into something positive in a really unexpected way. So as an academic, when you write a paper or a book, it gets sent to reviewers. So before it's published, it gets sent out to people whose job basically is to criticize your work. And some people take that really seriously. They give you some very harsh feedback just because they feel like that's their job. They don't often write back and say, this is wonderful. They feel like it's their obligation to give you things that you need to improve. My colleague Olivia and I wrote a book. It was called Sex, Gender, Sexuality in the Law. And we wrote it because we had been involved in legal cases and then mediations with non-traditional families, say with same-sex parents or transgender individuals. And it was a big mess. And this was before the marriage equality vote. And we were a little bit out of our depth because even though we'd done a lot of work in that field in law and in mediation, we weren't sort of gender specialists or sociologists or whoever would normally have the expertise in that field, but we were summarising a lot of literature from disciplines that were different from ours. So we were a little bit nervous about it, but we worked very, very hard on it. And the publisher sent it out to the reviewers, and she wrote back to us, our editor, and said, look, one of the reviewers has been scathing. Like, I just want to warn you before you open it. It's pretty brutal. And Olivia and I read it and our hearts just sank and we were like, oh my gosh, we really don't know what we're talking about. This was a huge mistake. And we were really, really upset about it and thinking we would have to ditch the whole thing. And Olivia actually gets the credit for this. Olivia said, why don't we actually reach out to him? We didn't know him at all, but he had disclosed his name, which some reviewers don't do. And so we reached out to him and we wrote him an email and said, look, thank you so much. We were nervous about the fact that maybe we were missing, some things or misinterpreting some things. And while we found your feedback quite difficult to read, we're really motivated to work on it. But we're also conscious of the fact that we might not be the best people to work on it. Would you be willing to help us do some of the improvements that you've suggested and maybe be a co-author on our book? And he contacted us straight away and said, I did not expect that. I did not see that. And yes, I think I am interested in doing that. And it was really funny because he then went through all his own feedback because we said, could you have a look and help us? And when he got back to us, he said, I realised now I've had a really good look at it as a co-author. A lot of those things weren't really justified. So he took back a lot of the negative feedback when he was sort of invested in the outcome in a more direct way. Yeah. But he ended up being a co-author. If you're watching, thank you so much. And it was a much better book because of his contribution. And we could have just got angry and resentful and avoided him forever. But in fact, we got him onto the team and it was a much better book because of his contribution. So I think that was a really cool example of turning what started out as a really negative, hurtful experience into literal collaboration and an improved outcome.
Man, I like it. Make them accountable.
Yeah, that's right. Give them some investment in the outcome. Scott, I think we might be going to run out of time soon. What else shall we talk about before we wrap up?
Yes. What do you reckon? How would you like to finish?
I guess what are some pearls of wisdom that we can take maybe out of today's discussion? We've talked about so many different things. What would you say are some of the key learnings for listeners from today's episode?
Oh, crikey. You want me to do a summary?
Not a summary, just a couple of points. Just, what's connected with you in this conversation today?
Well, I did like your point about not necessarily having a relationship, but how you're going to relate going into the future. That resonated for me. And I think the interesting thing about culture and how that varies and whether it's more individual or there's other considerations in terms of family or community, I think that's interesting as well.
Scott, the things that you said about your thoughts are not necessarily your reality and that you have an opportunity to decide how to respond to them. I think that's super helpful. And the reminder that we can usually do more if we give ourselves a bit of time to do that self-reflection and to think about particularly the identity side of conflict. How is our own identity being triggered or challenged in this situation and what might be going on for the other person in the sense of identity? I think they're really useful things for people to talk about and think about.
And what of this conflict is mine? How am I contributing? I think that's the other one. It's like a blind spot. We don't often see our own contribution. So I think to reflect on that is really useful as well.
Yeah. And at the risk of sounding too kind of postmodern wishy-washy, in some ways, conflict is just a story that we tell ourselves, and sometimes it's a story that society tells us. And the beauty of conflict when we're one of the characters is we can have an impact on the next chapter. We can choose our own adventure and make some changes in the script. We can turn a melodrama into, I don't know, a romance or a comedy. I'm not suggesting that you fall in love with everyone you're in conflict with, but we can have a twist in the tale and turn it into something more positive with a bit of intention and self-reflection, and sometimes getting support from a mediator or a coach or somebody who can help you to step a little bit outside of yourself and manage those emotions.
Yeah, nice. You're just trying to pitch your services there, Sam? Is that how we're finishing off?
That's right. Yes. And what I'm really hoping is maybe in 6 to 12 months we can rename our podcast Peace Stories, because we will have done all of this work.
Oh, that's cool. Well, that might be a good place to finish, do you think, for our first podcast?
Yes, and I'm really excited about meeting our guests. We've got some great guests lined up, and I'm really interested in listening to other people's conflict stories. And it is a little bit like reality TV, but educational reality TV. We can learn from other people's conflict experiences. It's not going to be Love Island, but...
Not quite. All right, excellent. Well, thanks, Sam. That was fabulous. Great to do our first podcast, and look forward to the next one that will be coming up. And it's a surprise guest, is it?
Yes, everyone's going to be surprised. See you next time, and everyone keep on working towards a more peaceful future.
Nice. Enjoy your conflict. Thank you.